always, our heartiest thanks to the Friends of the Rogers Public Library who sponsored this program. And with no more ado, I want to introduce Sean Fitzgibbon, who is going to tell us all about his gloriously beautiful graphic novel about the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs.
Okay, wow, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so I've been working on this book for off and on probably for the last 15 years. So it's been a big project. And so anyway, thanks for coming out. I really appreciate that. And I'll just go on. So yeah, so let me just kind of lay out what I'm going to talk about. I just want to talk mostly about why the Crescent Hotel, like why I've always been interested in the Crescent, why I'm interested in the Norman Baker years when it was the Baker Hospital, and Eureka Springs. And it's really those three things just sort of culminate into this book that I've been working on, and thankfully it's finished and it's going to be available probably around the first of the year, I would imagine. So anyway, okay, so I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about the story, and then I'll kind of go a little bit into the process of how I create a graphic novel. And this is this is nonfiction, so it's a nonfiction graphic novel. So anyway. So in 2019, there was I don't know if y'all are aware, there was a very grim discovery that was made on the grounds of the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, and it garnished national attention. There was a landscape architect working on the grounds, digging, and then these little jars came tumbling out. And she kept digging, and the next thing you know, they found hundreds of jars. And what appeared to be in these jars appeared to be human samples of human tissue within sort of soaked in alcohol, and along with these human jars, they found Norman Baker's cancer cure elixir, along with 16 millimeter film reels that were advertising for his cancer cure, his so-called cancer cure. Of course, immediately this was sent to state crime labs. Like at first, it was a crime scene, and then once they realized what it was, it became more of like archaeological survey was out. It became more of an archaeological dig. And so anyway, so this was in 2019. It's kind of interesting because this happened around the same time I was actually finishing this book, completing it. And that was, it's funny because it kind of dovetails. When I first started working on this book, I interviewed a guy who as a child, with a friend of his, explored in the Crescent Hotel when it was abandoned after Baker was arrested in 1939 during World War II. So throughout the early 1940s, pretty much through World War II, it was empty, and he was exploring in there, and he came across a very grim discovery within these walls. And I'll get to that a little bit later, but so why this story? Why was I so interested in this? Well, as a kid, my family, I'm from Missouri, and so we would always take trips down to Eureka Springs, and I've just always been just completely fascinated by this little Victorian hamlet that's sort of nestled away in these within these kind of gorges and limestone bluffs, and the Queen Anne dwellings that are sort of perched high along these bluffs, and the serpentine roads that don't intersect. Uh, and also the subterranean village that I learned later that was buried beneath in the downtown. You know, there's actually it's like a town underneath the town. So it's what's called not Fayetteville, that's where I'm from, the Eureka Springs Underground. So you can actually go and see where there's a subterranean portion of the town downtown. And so as a child, I had learned that Eureka Springs was deemed one of the 9 most unusual towns in the U.S. by Ripley's Believe It or Not. And so as a fan of that show growing up, I was always just very, very intrigued by that. And it does, Eureka definitely earns its reputation. I'm still intrigued by the sort of aberrant maze-like geometry and geology of this sort of stair-step town. And not only that, but like the Basin Street, or the Basin Park Hotel that has 7 street level entrances. So it's like every floor you're at ground level. So it's like, but that's the way it is in Eureka. You know, it's almost like down is up and up is down. It's just, I'm just so fascinated by that. And it's the only city, I don't know if y'all know, it's the only city in the entire U.S. whose entire downtown is on the historic registry. So the entire downtown. So pretty fascinating. None of the streets cross at right angles. There's no stoplights. The entire layout's irregular. I always like, too, how it feels like, here you can see, these are all panels from my book, by the way. But so much of it is so identifiable when you look at historic photos. You're like, oh, I know exactly where I am, because it's still, like, you can just feel like you can reach out and touch history, you know? It's just so fascinating. Anyway, but yeah, just how these sort of natural elements and the Victorian elements just sort of coalesce. But the thing that intrigued me the most growing up was always the Crescent Hotel that sits, just almost looms over the entire city. In fact, it's actually sitting at the highest point of town. And it had just the very assorted and somewhat dark and colorful past of this hotel. So I always found that extremely, extremely interesting. So what about the Crescent Hotel? What is it that is so fascinating? Like, so many people are intrigued by the Crescent Hotel to this day. In fact, it's even known as America's most haunted hotel, and there's so many different, you hear about it so much in just, regionally and then sometimes nationally. So anyway, we can kind of look at that really quick. Well, the Crescent Hotel was built in 1886. And during this time, the Eureka Springs was rapidly turning into this health resort. And this was due to the fact that, they had the spring waters, hence Eureka Springs. And people would move there for the clean mountain air and the healing spring waters, as they said. And this is up on the right-hand side there. That's Arkansas Governor Pal Clayton. He was at this time he was instrumental in helping develop Eureka Springs. And he was also developing railroad during this time to help make the town much more accessible to people from all over the U.S., which, if you think about it, that's quite an amazing feat when you just drive to Eureka Springs, and it's like, it's pretty harrowing, the mountains that you sort of drive through. And so just imagine getting a railroad through there. But they did it. And anyway, so the design of the hotel it was designed by an architect by the name of Isaac Stockton Taylor, and it's done in an American Gothic style. And he built the hotel using the limestone that was quarried near the nearby White River. And so that's one of the reasons too, like in Eureka Springs, how these houses, why it's so incredibly unusual is because it is all these limestone bluffs that these houses are built on. And so that's why they're not just sliding down the hill, because they're on these solid foundations. But it's so, because of that, it's just so incredibly unique. But anyway, so this hotel was a hotel for the rich and famous. Like when this thing was first built, it had all the amenities, a full bowling alley, Edison lighting. This is 1886, and a working elevator, and it was very exclusive. Like it was an exclusive place, and not just anybody could get in there. In fact, there was a waiting list, and you had to be on a list, to be a guest of the hotel. But unfortunately, despite all its splendor, it had financial difficulties, and it just wasn't, after a few years, they started to realize, well, it just was not that lucrative. There just weren't as many people staying at the hotel, and so around 1908, to supplement sort of these lagging, the lagging winter hotel business, they turned the Crescent into the Crescent College and Conservatory for young women. So it was a very, very nice, very progressive sort of school for young ladies at that time. And this was pretty successful, and it actually went for quite a while. So they kind of operated as this sort of, summer sort of vacation resort. And then in the winter, throughout the fall and spring semester, it became the girls' school. And this was all well and good until, of course, the Great Depression hits. And then around in 1934, they just couldn't do it anymore. And so they ended up shutting down. And this is something that would happen quite a bit throughout the Crescent's history. And so anyway, the hotel is dormant, and there's no one there except the rodents scurrying about, maybe a few ghosts here and there. Anyway, and it just pretty much is abandoned until 1937, and that's the time when the Crescent undergoes its strangest transformation in this very unique piece of real estate's history. So this is when it becomes the cancer hospital, and known as the Baker Hospital, operated by Norman Baker. And so anyway, so what I'm going to do now is back up or go forward, I guess, to back when I was a child visiting Eureka Springs. And so as a child, my family, we would go up to the Crescent Hotel, and we'd go on the ghost tours. And that's still a thing today. Like, it's a very big thing there. Now, back during this time, the ghost tours weren't quite as historical as they are now. They've actually gotten a lot more historical, and there were a lot of legends and that have sort of grown up over the years about Baker and his time at the Crescent, because some of that was sort of obscure and it was very sensational. So anyway, I always heard all these kind of strange stories about, when it was the cancer hospital, and about this, this sort of maverick, fraudulent medical practitioner who comes wheeling into town driving a purple Cord Roadster, which at that time, this is 1937, there weren't really very many purple cars anywhere. They were all black, right? And so, and Baker himself was this character. He was very flamboyant sort of character. He wore these white suits with purple a lavender shirt, purple ties, driving a purple car, and anyway, and coming to town with the cure for cancer. And and of course, these stories over the years became very sort of ghoulish because, of course, we all knew he did not have the cure. So a lot of the stories kind of conjured up these feelings of like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein meets Stephen King's The Shining in my head. And of course, that left me very morbidly curious. And those stories kind of haunted me over the years. And so in 2003, I ended up moving to Fayetteville for graduate school to pursue my MFA. And that's where I met my wife. And we would travel down to Eureka, on the weekends some. And we stayed at the Crescent Hotel and went on the ghost tour. And sure enough, we'd hear a lot of these same sort of stories. Just these very bizarre kind of stories. One of the things like exorbitant amounts of calcium that was found in the walls and the floors of the Crescent Hotel, and stories of like unaccounted patients, and anyway, so I was like, I was very skeptical about some of this, like hundreds of unaccounted patients and this and that, and so that kind of made me think like, so what really did happen? So we would stay at the Crescent, and I remember after going on one of the tours, I was like, you know what? Tomorrow we're going to go to the library, and I want to do a little research. And we both did. My wife's a librarian, so she was game, So we strolled down to the library in Eureka Springs, and I was really pretty surprised that there wasn't really a whole lot of information on the enigmatic Norman Baker or his time in Eureka Springs, which he was really only there for a little over 2 years. It was like 2.5 years from 1937 to 1939. So we just started doing a bunch or I did. I started doing a whole bunch of research after that. I ended up coming back down to Eureka, and then the next thing you know, I'm driving up to Muscatine, Iowa, and I'm doing research there because that's where Norman Baker was from. And what I ended up finding was actually stranger. It was different, but stranger than the stories that I'd been hearing all these years. And so, anyway, so kind of like I did earlier with like, well, what's up with the Crescent Hotel? Well, what's up with Norman Baker? Who was Norman Baker? And what's the story with him? So, okay, so Norman Baker, he was born in 1889 in Muscatine, Iowa, and he was his father was a machinist, and in the 10th grade, he decided to quit school, and he was going to work as a machinist himself, which he was actually quite good at. However, he was very combative, like with people. He made enemies quite often, and he ends up working. He ends up working for, it's called the Bopal Button Company in Muscatine, and they make pearl buttons. And Muscatine's right on the Mississippi River, so it's pearls that are extracted from the Mississippi. And anyway, after sort of a cantankerous sort of relationship with the owner of the Bopal Button Company, Norman ends up taking off and ends up becoming a vaudeville magician. He was very interested in, so he went from machinist to vaudeville magician. He was very interested in the sort of, the power of the mind and sleight of hand, perception. And so anyway, as a way to sort of publicize his stage performances during this time, he ends up creating the world's first air calliope. So before this, calliopes were they ran on steam. And so, that's one of the crazy things too about Baker. He was actually brilliant. He was very, very smart. And he did invent the world's first air calliope. In fact, there's people today that's what they know Baker for. If he had just stayed doing that, he was actually making millions off he called it the Calliophone. He would have been, he would have just lived his life out a prominent citizen, and he would have been known for building the Calliophone, which what those are, like you like at the baseball games or the circus, those sort of like, it's like a doot 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 doot, it's like a little organ type thing. Those are called calliopes, and he calls his a Calliophone. So anyway, and so he would use that as a way to sort of promote his vaudeville, his magician acts. So someone would actually just sit there and play these to get people's attention, and they would come around. And it's funny because he would actually use that throughout his entire career, this Calliophone, to kind of attract attention. So during this time, cancer was rapidly becoming the leading cause of death in the U.S., and his mother had died of cancer. And her untimely death brought about this interest in Norman Baker in life extension. And so he decided, he had heard about a guy in Kansas City, Missouri by the name of Charles Ozias, and he had claimed to come up with a cure for cancer. And so Baker ends up basically stealing his cancer cure and, claiming it for himself. And he then starts he decides to open up his own radio station so he can start publicizing this cancer cure, right? And this is in 1925. And much like I was saying earlier, when he was, working at the Bopal Button Company, he's making enemies a lot with people throughout the town. In fact, he's making enemies with everybody. He's making enemies with bankers, with prominent citizens, attorneys, doctors, you name it. And he then starts lashing out at the AMA, the American Medical Association, and then, of course, the Federal Radio Commission, because, of course, he's using more wattage for his radio so he can get the word out, and they're trying to, just knock him down a bit. So anyway, Baker then decides that he's going to open up his own cancer, the Baker Hospital, and he renovates an old skating rink in Muscatine and turns this old skating rink into his hospital. And from the research I did, I'll tell you, it was not the most sanitary place in the world. Let me tell you. And then he publishes what he calls TNT Magazine, and that's an acronym for The Naked Truth. And that his radio station was KTNT, and that's Know the Naked Truth. So, and this is in 1929. So along with his medical exposés, he's a brilliant businessman. He's an entrepreneur. So he's actually selling goods, like he's basically using it as to sell merchandise. So his magazine is also almost like a Sears and Roebuck, where you can buy all the way from car tires to sunflower seeds to licorice, anything, home lamps, brooms, you name it. There's even one picture where he's just holding a broom. And I have copies of these magazines, and he sells all kinds of things. But he does become more and more into the cancer healing idea and lashing out against the American Medical Association. I think he was more interested in making enemies with the AMA than he was really curing cancer, to be honest. But so anyway, this is where it starts to kind of go south as far as, and you kind of get the sense that, okay, this guy's not on the up and up, at least from what I can read here. So he ends up saying, okay, he finds these 5 patients that he's willing to treat with his miraculous cancer cure free of charge. So then he prints this in his magazine, TNT Magazine. He says, cancer is curable. I've found the cure, and I have the cure for cancer. And he does this in the December 1929 issue of TNT. And then by May of 1930, every single one of those patients has died of cancer. And then what's Baker do? He reprints the magazine, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He keeps reprinting it without changing a single word. And he also publicizes that on his radio station. So yeah, that's where I'm like, yeah, I don't know about that, So anyway, so by this time, of course, he's really in this heated battle with the American Medical Association. They're really cracking down on him. And so the AMA starts pressuring the Federal Radio Commission to shut him down. Well, they're successful. And then, of course, Baker sues. He's always involved in litigation. He's constantly suing people right and left. He sues the AMA and the American Radio Association unsuccessfully, or he is unsuccessful in his attempt to sue them. And so he ends up taking off. He leaves town. He ends up going down to Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, where he opens up another little cancer hospital and a radio station, and that one's called XENT. And so anyway, he's doing that for a while, and he brings in quite a bit of money by doing that. They call these guys border blasters. They end up going down to the border, and they're just spewing out all kinds of false claims that they can do this and that, and making enemies with everybody. And so anyway, eventually, Baker decides to head back to the U.S., and then it's in 1937 that he eventually makes his way up to Eureka Springs, and then he ends up purchasing the downtrodden, at the time, Crescent Hotel. And because if you remember, it had been dormant for quite a few years. And so Baker is basically sort of capitalizing on what is it about Eureka Springs that was making it so popular? Well, the healing springs, right? So, and the clean mountain air, and he uses that, in his brochures to kind of help bring, kind of lure people to his hospital. And this is where it really gets crazy. So to kind of match his whole demeanor and his car and everything, he kind of starts transforming the hotel itself. And his remodeling is really quite strange. He goes from the beautiful woodwork in the original hotel and the absolutely gorgeous original fireplace, and then he just starts painting it just all these kind of garish, sort of like a circus. It actually looked like a circus. It was very Art Deco sort of motifs throughout, but he starts slathering on his custom purple. Like purple was Baker's #1 color. Like he loved the color purple, which on a psychological level, it makes sense because it is sort of a healing kind of color that calms people. And so he was, like I said, he was smart and he understood a lot about psychology. However, as you can see, like he was using this hodgepodge of orange, red, black, yellow, and all these kind of crazy circus-like colors. And he slathered his posters all over the walls. And he also would he would scrawl like his populist sort of rhetoric and propaganda on the walls as well. Like here you can see where it says, "Quacks are those who do things enemies cannot do." And when he says quacks, people, he was known as a cancer quack by the AMA and the medical establishment. And so he's basically just kind of taken that, and owning that word there, that can't, saying, yeah, I'm a quack, but he's going to own it. So anyway, I think the part that really just kind of, I love architecture, and the part that really kind of breaks my heart whenever I see this is so on the exterior, the original wooden porches with those wood turned balustrades, So that's that part of the Crescent. Like if you look at the old photographs and you look at it today, it looks different. And so he had those removed, those beautiful balustrades, and in its place, he poured 4 floors of concrete in, and you can kind of see that, and made sun porches, and that's so the patients could wheel their chairs and beds out on, and it would support the weight of all the patients out there. And this, sadly, this is what really did kind of permanently damage the Victorian appearance of the hotel, and that was quite a shame. In Baker's office, he had purple walls, and he had a hexagonal desk, and actually you can see that desk. Half of it. I don't know whatever happened to the other half, but half of that desk is actually at the Crescent today. Right when you walk in there, you can see Baker's desk. So that's really interesting. But Baker actually had bulletproof glass around his desk, and if you notice, if you look behind him, you can see a gun on the wall. So he was very. He was always looking over his shoulder. He was always afraid that his enemies were out to get him. And so he always had a gun within reach, and he was also known for wearing bulletproof vests everywhere he went, and so he was kind of on edge, kind of a guy that was on edge. So anyway, and then on top of that, he widely advertised his cancer hospital throughout the U.S., everywhere, and his brochure was saying, where sick folks get well. We cure cancer tumor, just without operation, without radium or X-ray. And so that's how he promoted it, which is false, of course. But and the money just kept rolling in despite the Great Depression. And so that's why you wonder, it's like, well, why was he able to stay? Well, he was a boon for Eureka Springs during the Great Depression. Businesses were thriving, which most places in the U.S. couldn't claim that during that time. But sadly, the death toll kept rising. But then but so were federal law enforcement investigations, during this time. And so finally, in 1939. Well, that's the church right outside just down the hill from the Crescent there. And 1939, they finally got him. They finally got Baker on, of all things, mail fraud, because he's distributing these brochures that just blatantly says we can cure cancer, and so. Anyway, so Baker ends up getting sentenced 4 years in prison at Leavenworth. He only ends up serving a little over 3 years, though. After being released from prison, he tries unsuccessfully to start back up his cancer hospital, and he eventually ends up retiring in Florida and living on a 3-story yacht. And in 1958, ironically, he dies of cancer. So, and that's, I guess what goes around comes around. So, and then, so now, if you remember earlier, I was talking about the gentleman that I had interviewed. That as a child, he went into the Crescent Hotel after Baker was incarcerated, and it was just empty, throughout World War II. And so, oh yeah, the Crescent used to have the Statue of Liberty outside because 1886 is when it was built, and that's the same year that the Statue of Liberty was erected. So anyway, just a little, if you're wondering what's the Statue of Liberty doing there. So anyway, during this time that it was empty, it was really interesting I was so fortunate to be able to interview him because he had a friend, and they snuck on the grounds, which wasn't too difficult. They just walked right up there, and they were able to walk right in. And they worked their way through the abandoned Baker Hospital, and they made many, many strange discoveries while they were there. And instead of sterile white walls within the building, they were really kind of shocked to just find these extremely garish sort of circus colored interiors with Art Deco among these just forgotten wheelchairs and cancer is curable posters throughout. And then the two boys moved downstairs into the basement, and they made it into the room that served as the hospital morgue. And then they made a very grim discovery. And what they found was the very same set of jars containing human tissue and the so-called cancer cure elixir that would be unearthed 80 years later at the Crescent Hotel grounds. So anyway, of course, the boys were horrified and morbidly curious and intrigued by this and fascinated by this discovery, you know. And anyway, so as the boys worked their way through the structure, this abandoned building, they failed to realize one thing. It's like the abandoned building that they were entering wasn't really a hospital, and nor was it really a hotel. What they had entered was the remnants of an abandoned theater. It was a theater that was run by a sideshow magician whose performance had ended. His cancer elixir was made up of carbolic acid, alcohol, glycerin, and spring water. But the formula's true ingredients was demagoguery and populist rhetoric. And now these relics that these boys discovered, they told a story. Together they told a story of a past and predictions of the future, of a charlatan's performance that had been repeated throughout the ages and continues to this day. One that, rather than garnish applause as the curtains fall, ends with an empty silence, an empty promise, an empty cure, an empty structure. Now, Norman Baker died lonely, but throughout his life, those he met either became his devout followers or his mortal enemies. Even 60 years after his death, Norman Baker still divides people. Just after his funeral, his grave was destroyed and then later replaced. And then the gravesite to this day is decorated mysteriously on the anniversary of his death by someone with purple flowers. Every year on his anniversary of his death, purple flowers are placed on his grave. And so, love him or hate him, at the core, my book is about perception. You know, we see history the way we want to see it. This very unique nonfiction graphic novel is my best interpretation of this very peculiar person, place, and time. Although Baker's been gone for many years now, echoes of his time in Eureka Springs still reverberate throughout the Crescent Hotel. And that's pretty much that. I just wanted to, really quick, before I kind of wrap it up and we can have some quick questions, I just want to tell you a little bit about my process. This book blends oral histories, newspaper articles, and Norman Baker's vanity biography that coalesced into a visual, stunning narrative. I began working on this project clear back in 2008. I've interviewed scores of people in both Muscatine, Iowa, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas. So, let's see here. I've scoured libraries, archives, databases, dug through old newspapers, microfiche, court cases, old photos, books, criminal records, you name it. And I spent quite a bit of time exploring cemeteries and locating the graves of many of the people found in this book. And of course, Norman Baker. Then comes, I think, probably the most difficult portion of doing a book like this is organizing all this material after you do all this field work and taking all this material and putting it together. Luckily, that's where it helped to have my wife, but she's a librarian, and so she was instrumental in helping me kind of organize all of this chronologically, and we would just kind of put it all in different labels, like, okay, this is Baker's early years, this is Crescent Hotel, chronological information, this is Muscatine years, this is the Muscatine Hospital, this is, I just keep categorizing all these different little sections. And so once I've done all that, then I get to go to my favorite part. I get to sharpen my pencil and get to drawing. And so that's my cat. That's me right there. That's my cat Buzz. And he's serving as my art director, I guess. So anyway, so what I generally do is I'll kind of put together a script using all my collected interviews, photos, and other research. Originally, I start out in sort of a paragraph form, and then I start kind of breaking that down. And I draw very, very rough storyboards while I'm kind of putting this together. After turning my roughs to tight pencils, I then begin spotting the dark areas, and then I'll kind of build up using some value, and then on top of that, I'll start laying in color. And so I decided to go, introduce color in this big book because I do have a tendency to jump. Well, we jump through time quite a bit. Like we'll be in the present, we'll be in the Crescent Hotel when it was the Baker Hospital. So we move from the early 2000s to the 1930s, and then we'll move back, to the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So that era is more sepias. Baker's era is more purples because he was all about purple. And then in the present, I tend to use more of a green color. So, so here you can see my pencil panel, very tight pencils, and then after I paint it using watercolor. And then what I'll do is go over, I'll scan it, and I can do little effects like lighting effects digitally. Like with the sun going through the window there, which if I were to do it traditionally, I could use an airbrush and just kind of brush in, a little bit of light effects there. I often write notes to myself when I'm roughing out pages for the book. And here you can see those notes with my thumbnails and then the finished pencils of this page. And then you can see my value drawing and then the colors. I like to work in value because I can, as Leslie and I were talking about earlier, I like to get that really, really dark areas and then the really, really light areas, and you have that full range of value, and you're able to work between both of those. And it really works when you go to the printer, so it just pops. You have that contrast. So it's great. Another example of just kind of building up from pencils to final. There's another one here. I also, a lot of props. I would find a lot of old props. Some were actual props. Like I found an old radio from the era. A friend of mine had an old wheelchair from that era, and model cars. Like I'll buy a lot of model cars from like that little car that Baker had. Like I'll use those for reference. Toy guns and automobiles. And so anyway, also, when I would scour the internet for clothing from the era. So when you're drawing say the 1930s, I'm not just looking for clothing in the 1930s, but I'm looking for clothing in the South in the 1930s. And not only the South, but in the Ozarks in the 1930s. So it's different, One of the challenges, let's see here, is so I'm basically just kind of thoroughly researching not only the history, but the geography of the Crescent Hotel and all the various periods. So that's one of the great things about when you read this book is it's a book that kind of demands multiple reads because you'll be in one part of the hotel in the present, and then you'll see that very same room in the 1930s or in the turn of the century, and so you can kind of see all the different changes. But much like Eureka, you still recognize where you are immediately, but it's different. So it really did involve a lot of research, just making sure that I was keeping up with all that. So anyway. And so in this book, not only is Norman Baker a big character, but I would say equally the Crescent Hotel is a big character in this book. Because like I said, the reader just sort of traverses the hallways and all the different rooms throughout the hotel. And as I mentioned earlier, at its core, this book is about perception. Well, we perceive our history and reality differently. We draw from our own interpretations based on a myriad of factors and that influence our understanding of places and events. So anyway, I look forward to taking you all on this journey, and I hope that this book will inspire everyone to travel to Eureka Springs, and hope you can traverse the very same halls that the doctors and the patients of the Baker Hospital did so many years ago. So anyway, I have a couple of, there's a little Baker when he was a child. So there's a couple of images of what the book will look like. It's like I said, it's fully painted, it's nonfiction graphic novel. So anyway, and so that's it. So yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions at all, I think we have a little bit of time. Yeah.
What about the ghost?
What's that?
What about the ghost?
The ghost? Yeah. Well, I mean, I look at this book like it is truly one of the origin stories for all the ghost tours. You know, like so many of the ghost tours. There's the ghost of the guy Michael. He was a stonemason that fell when they were actually building the hotel, and it was room. Gosh, I'm trying to think right now. Room 213. I'm trying to think of what room number. 213? No, that's not right. 214 maybe. But anyway, he landed where that room would eventually be, you know, and so that's one of the most sort of haunted ones. And so that's actually before the Baker Hospital. But when it was the Baker Hospital, there's a ghost that they say is, her name's Theodora, and she was a woman who worked at the Baker Hospital. It's kind of interesting. Most of them, though, are there's one that's a very sad story because it was a child that had fell off the down the stairwell in the you know, she was playing, and she was actually one of the nurse's children, and she fell to her death. And that's what they say is one of the supposed ghosts that people see, or they'll, you know, feel like, they say she'll go up and tap you, you know. And so anyway, yeah, it's kind of interesting because you would think it'd be with such a place, you know, a place where there was, you know, quite a bit of death. I don't think there was as much as you would think, because I think Baker was, he tended to have people, he kind of shuffle people off before they died, and they go off, you know, and that's, but they did, of course, have death. And it was, and at the Baker Hospital. So, I mean, if any place is going to be haunted. Oh, and there's also the nurse that they say will be going down the hall pushing a wheelchair or pushing a gurney. That's one of the Baker Hospital. So that I've always thought that was a very eerie kind of thing to put in your head, just to see this more.
Did you ever interview any of these people that say they saw ghosts?
I have, and they just kind of told you, you know, like I talked with someone who said they saw, someone once told me they saw a person, like I said, it was a woman pushing looked like a wheelchair, and she went around a corner, and they went over there to ask her because they thought she was like she was dressed in what looked like period clothing, and they went around the corner and she wasn't there. And so that was pretty strange. Anyway, I don't know. I wasn't really. That's just the story. That's what I've heard, and then of course I've heard, and I've been on the many times on the different ghost tours by different different people giving the ghost tour. So I've heard a lot of different accounts and different stories. So, but yeah, it's yeah.
So he just called himself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, what was
Did
that?
the railroad ever get to Eureka Springs?
What's that?
The railroad, did it ever completely get to Eureka?
That's a good question. Actually, it did. It did actually. There's the railroad. It's right there at Eureka Springs. You can go there now and still see the railroad. Yeah, it is there. There's a train stop right there in Eureka. In fact, you can there's a working train. Like you can ride on the train. So yeah, it's there. And they did. Yeah, that's how. Yeah, Pal Clayton was one of the movers and shakers. Like he really was instrumental in helping bring people to the area. And yeah, in fact, he did it. It's there today. It's a beautiful little train station, and I think they have like period trains that kind of go through there. It's really neat. I think you can even do like a little, kind of like they do from Springdale to Van Buren type thing. I think you can do that in Eureka. At least I would think so. I mean, it's such a beautiful area. Oh, you have? Yeah. I need to do that. I should do that sometime.
Yeah, it's a very short trip.
Oh, is it? Okay. All right. Well, that's all right. Yeah.
Where is his grave?
His grave is in Muscatine, Iowa. I think I cannot for the life of me, Greenview Cemetery. I can't think of the name right now, but yeah, I spent some time there. I located it, and I did a what do they call that? Like a chalk rubbing, off the grave, and I have that at home. It's him and the plaque is him and his sister Irma. Baker had 10 brothers and sisters, and he fell out of favor. Like all of his siblings didn't want anything to do with him, except he had one sister that was pretty devout to Baker throughout his life, and so they share a plot, Baker and his sister Irma. So Baker was the youngest, but it's a nice little cemetery there, and it's a big cemetery, But sure enough, whenever I went there was purple flowers right there by the grave, And what's wild is nobody knows who plants those. They place those there every year on the anniversary of his death. They don't know who does it. It's another little mystery there. Yeah.
Did anybody analyze the contents of all these jars?
Oh yeah. It's tumors, and that's one of the strange things about that. In fact, you can go to there now. Like in fact, I was there a couple weeks ago, and they took me in, and they showed me the whole dig and everything. It's pretty amazing. And then some of those are just. There's no question in your mind, what that is. And they did all kinds of analysis on these, and cancerous tumors, which is very strange because Baker was such a conundrum because his whole thing was about we don't use surgery, we don't use radium, and no X-ray. Then why are you cutting out these two? What's that all about? Like it just really makes no sense.
Did he just call himself a doctor?
He actually did not. Now that's actually one of the things. Baker did not call himself a doctor. People called him Dr. Baker. In fact, they still call him that today, and he never corrected anyone. But he himself never said he was a doctor, although he considered himself an expert in medicine, which he had not a single day of medical training. Yeah.
So you think he bought his own hive?
I think so. I think Baker was so much into that just power of positive thought, which is a good thing, but he took it to such an extreme that it's really hard to say what Baker believed and what he didn't, but in some ways, I think he was a shyster, but I think in some ways, I think he really did think that it's like, well, he was known for saying like, well, she didn't want to live bad enough. Well, she shouldn't have died. If she just, like, like he was like that, cantankerous about someone's death, and, with cancer because, well, they just didn't follow all the directions. And aside from taking his elixir, he also had all these different exercises that people would have to do. And you'd have to go through this whole, he had a whole booklet. And that was kind of, I think, sort of his fail-safe. When it didn't work, he'd be like, well, they just didn't do all the stuff that you're supposed to do, which was almost impossible. So much stuff that, you have to do this and then that. And there's all these different, regimen, eat this and, all these different things. But, Baker was in some ways kind of progressive because he was one of his enemies. He made enemies with everybody, but he was against the aluminum trust, like Alcoa, the aluminum makers, which, aluminum is known as being kind of a carcinogen, right? And cancer. And so there is this, you can see that maybe there's something to it, but he was also into very sort of holistic foods, and so which that's good, right? But he wasn't curing cancer. Not at all.
He made $10 million.
Exactly. That's what he was doing. I think he was just making money. But so many things about him just don't really make sense.
Did he ever marry?
He did. Well, yes, actually, he did once. He did. When he devised the calliope phone during that time, he married a woman, and her name was Teresa Pender, and he had these women that during his vaudeville performances that he would like levitate and do all this kind of stuff, like they were his the partner, his vaudeville partner, and she was one of those, and it was during that, and he wasn't married very long, like they only, but. Her father was like a musician and also he was also kind of known for like dabbling and building like organs and things like that. And so there's a little bit of a question as far as the patent on that, if Baker, if it's really, like if he just stole it outright, but I don't know. He was a machinist, so he could have actually done that actually. But he was a ladies' man. Like he always, there's almost always, women throughout his life, but he was married once, briefly. Didn't last very long. They just had kind of but it was very amicable, just sort of, they parted ways, and that was that. A few years. So, and that was early on, the teens probably, early 20s, I guess. Yeah.
Who owns the hotel today?
Her name is Elise Rennick. In the early 90s, Elise and Marty Rennick, they moved from, I want to say like around Massachusetts, somewhere back east. And it's crazy because around that time, the hotel was slated to become a chicken farm. Like they were going to tear it down. Yeah, it was going to, and that which would have been the most awful, horrific chapter in the hotel's history, it was almost, and if you can imagine such a beautiful town of Eureka Springs, at the highest point, a chicken farm. Like it was like, and of course, it'd be connected with Tyson, but yeah, that did not, thankfully, Elise and Marty Rennick, they saved it. And they also bought the Basin Park Hotel. And at that time, the Crescent was it was pretty downtrodden. It was pretty rough. But they were like, we want to restore this hotel to its original glory, and or as close as you can with like the sun porches and all that stuff that Baker really did tear up. But anyway, that's and Marty's no longer with us, but Elise is with us. In fact, I met Elise. I had never met her, but I met her just a few weeks ago when Keith Scales took me down to the where the jars were, the dig, the bottle dump, whatever you want to call it, So yes, nice lady, and
Has it been placed in a trust or something like that so that no one will make it a chicken farm.
Oh, well, I think I would imagine now it's pretty safe because it's so well loved. I can't imagine anyone trying to do that now. Like people absolutely love the Crescent Hotel, you know. Yeah. So I don't think that'll happen. I doubt. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.